Hello everyone, my name's Kaz, and to get things started, I'd like to begin with a little bit of a thought experiment, sort of game of sorts. I'm going to say some words and phrases, some descriptors of a group of people, and it's your job to try and guess in your heads who it is that I'm talking about. Let's do this. All right. Revolutionary, disruptive, threats, violence, attempted assassinations, guerrilla warfare, arson, bombings, death. Hopefully, we are now all thinking of the same group of historic individuals. That's right, the suffragettes. Okay, I'll admit that was a pretty morbid and confusing version of Guess Who, but there was a point to it. I'm sure there's a range of responses in the room right now. Some of you might be surprised to find out that they're not the group of peaceful protesters you might have thought they were. Some of you might be aware that they engaged in many attacks. And some of you are just in pieces that you didn't win tonight's round of Who's That Terrorist. Regardless, today I want to talk to you all about the moral complexities of rebellion, starting out with a little bit more about the suffragettes and their lesser-known counterpart, the suffragists. Perhaps the most iconic of all UK protesters are those of the suffragettes, also known as the Women's Social and Political Union. They campaigned fearlessly in the face of oppression, and while public views were scattered and the government was repeatedly at odds with them, they continued to fight. Eventually, in the 1910s, assuring women the right to vote. History looks at them like martyrs. They sacrificed their reputation, their freedom, but crucially their lives. I'm sure many of you have heard of Emily Davidson, a suffragette trampled by the King's horse at a derby, 4 days later losing her life. She, among others, was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the greater good. But what current-day politicians preaching the power of peaceful protest don't like to recall is the not-so-picturesque aspects in the fight for equal rights. See, while those under the banner of the suffragists were well acquainted with lobbying, politics, and typical means of legislative success, the suffragettes were much more violent. They took their motto, deeds not words, seriously, dishing out threats, setting buildings on fire. They're even attributed in creating the letter bomb, used a multitude of times against the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. These militant activists posed a great question. At what point should we really fight oppression? Even in the case of pacifist protesters, Martin Luther King Jr. is known to have said, "A riot is the language of the unheard," attributing the acts of violence not just to the perpetrators, but also to those who create the system of oppression, the cycle of suffering. In 1913, 10 years after the suffrage movement was founded, the movement itself was forced to change. The franchise bill, detailing a motion for equal voting rights, was posed to Parliament, but inevitably shot down by MPs, signifying that the fight would not end easily nor quickly. In Emmeline Pankhurst's autobiography, she stated that they were in deadly earnest when they declared they would adopt guerrilla warfare. And that they did, ramping up their attacks, setting more buildings alight, throwing axes in public, trying to kill more members of Parliament. They were now known as a terrorist organization, no longer just risking their own well-being, but damaging others too. Unfortunately, World War I put a swift end to the suffragettes' messaging as factions were dispersed as they braced for life in wartime. But after the UK had been forever changed by that war, the unification of the working class, now both men and women, against a common enemy led the fight for equal rights back to the forefront of politics, and this time with definitive success. In 1918, Parliament passed the Representation of the People Act, allowing all men over the age of 21 and all women over the age of 30 who own property the right to vote. Equality. Look, the battle against the patriarchy far from over, but this marked a turning point. Finally, women over the age of 30 who owned property had the right to vote. They could change the UK with their vote rather than their fists. So, what are the ethical implications of their actions? Due to their rage and negligence, among other instances, in 1913, 4 postal workers were brutally injured in the explosion of a letter bomb placed by the suffragettes. When fighting against the oppressor, does the ends justify the means? I'm sorry to say that I don't have a clear answer to this, as the question of moral violence is timeless. If we were to say that all violence against the oppressor is ethical, even with undesirable casualties, then that would include some maybe more questionable groups in with that logic. Also in the 1900s, the religious minority of Northern Irish Catholics were largely discriminated against, both in the language used towards them and a wider hatred for Irish citizens within English culture and legislation. This monolithic distrust and prejudice, along with decades of Unionist and Republican combat, led many Northern Irish Catholics to campaign for the reunification of a safer Catholic Ireland. This movement is what we now know as the formation of the IRA, one movement that is largely regarded as unjustified. It led to the deaths of nearly 3,600 people. But is it the death toll or the movement itself that delegitimizes Republicans' actions? We are in an era where we get enraged at Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain protesters for delaying our commute by, 30 minutes? And yet, if we're asked to find the key difference between the heroic suffragettes and the terrorist IRA, we kind of struggle. Within my first term of going to college, I attended a tutorial class on avoiding radicalization. The worst offender on their list, the new IRA. In that same term, in my politics class, we looked at protest groups, one of which, the suffragettes. Needless to say, in either class, it was never debated or discussed whether their actions were justified. It was just assumed that the suffragettes were the good guys, and the IRA, well, they're the bad. Herein lies our problem. It's this complete lack of critical thought that drives our ethical understanding into the muck. Look, I don't claim to know the key difference between the two groups, and I don't claim to support the violence that each of them enacted in their struggle for freedom, because up until recently, the thought had never crossed my mind. As our world delves further and further into unearthing discrimination and hate within our society, we are repeatedly faced with that same great question. At what point should we really fight oppression? I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Do you? Thank you.